From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I have the honor today of introducing our next author, Elizabeth McCracken. Elizabeth was an NEA Literature Fellow in 1992. You can read her official bio in the program, and I also encourage you to visit her website, elizabethmccracken.com, because it's got a really cool graphic on it. And in short, Elizabeth has written 5 books, including her most recent short fiction collection, Thunderstruck and Other Stories. And she's also been to school a lot. I think that these days we're so inundated with loss, with grief, with tragedy, whether it's in our Facebook feeds, our Twitter feeds, newspaper headlines, and sometimes it can be hard to understand what those words actually mean these days. They take on a sort of mythic, hard-to-hold quality. In the opening story of her collection, Something Amazing, Elizabeth writes about a daughter who's died. She writes, "Missy the allergen, Missy the poison. She's everywhere in the house, no matter how their mother scrubs and sweeps and burns and purges. She rises to the ceiling daily and collects there, drips down, tries again." I think one of Elizabeth's great gifts is the ability to make grief, to make loss, to make tragedy into human-sized words that make themselves comfortable in our everyday lives. During the long weeks when my own father was in the final stages of dying, one of the things I was surprised about is that in the midst of all that grief, there was still so much laughter. And I think that's her other great gift, understanding that comedy and tragedy aren't actually two separate entities, but different perspectives on the same story. We interviewed her at the NEA just a couple of weeks ago for our podcast with Joe Reed, and she said, "I believe that if there's a God, that Black humor is the comfort that he gives to us in difficult times. I can't imagine not joking, even at the worst of times." And with that, I give you Elizabeth McCracken.
Oh, that was one of the nicest introductions I've ever had. Thank you so much. And I'm also, this is a lot more people than I usually talk to in my day-to-day life. And I timed my reading this morning, or my talk, and it was 5 minutes. So I've made it a little longer. What I'm worried is that, like, in a fit of nerves, I've actually made it like 3 hours. But happily, the National Book Festival will wrestle me off the stage if I go too long. It's been 21 years since I last published a collection of short stories, which is more than 2 decades. It was last century, it was last millennium. Whenever you publish a short story collection after you've published a few novels, people ask you what the difference between short stories and novels is. And there are a lot of very common questions that aren't all that interesting, but this is one of the ones that really preoccupies me, both as a reader and as a writer. And lately I've been thinking about it this way. A novel is a historic reenactment, and a short story is a diorama. And I think I feel this way because as a child, I was transfixed by dioramas. I still am. I'm thinking of the ones particularly from my New England childhood, the glassed-in boxes at art and natural history museums and public libraries, which allowed you to see the Battle of Bunker Hill or a Canadian wilderness or into a George Bellows painting. In the first, for example, the miniature golfers, not miniature golfers, miniature soldiers. I have small children. Most things that are miniature are golf in my house. The miniature soldiers closest to the viewer were perfect minuscule models, but those in the next rank were less definite. In the next rank, they were little red-coated lumps, and the last painted on the back wall, half obscured by trompe-l'oeil smoke. Or in the second, the Canadian wilderness. For instance, The moose's taxidermied front half was attached by the waist to the wall. It lowered its head to sniff at a sculpted Ontario pond, while nearby, a shop-worn stuffed hare held still in startled mid-flight. The makers of dioramas shrink things down, or they bring them together, and then museum goers can understand what's being shown in a way that they never could had they been dropped into history or the wilderness, had they seen such things to scale. You can make all sorts of mistakes when you're working life-sized, and people will forgive them. They might not even notice. But to recreate life in a restricted space, you sometimes need to do outlandish things. My favorite short stories do this. They chop a moose in half. They show how a hare runs by stopping it in time forever. They take care to show the minuscule gun, the agony of the one man dying up close, the indeterminate fate of those far away, but never the bullet itself. They force perspective. That's my recent thinking, anyhow. Around the time I was writing stories for my first book, about 25 years ago, my friend Bruce Holbert told me that he'd heard that a short story was like a passionate love affair and a novel was a long marriage. I'm a pessimist and a complainer, so I translated this into terms that I could understand. A short story was like a blow to the solar plexus, and a novel was a long illness you might never recover from. I still pretty much believe that. I wrote a lot of short stories before I ever tried my hand at novels. In the late 80s, when I went to graduate school, we were taught that short stories were sort of apprentice work for novel writing, which is a theory I do not believe in at all because they seem so different to me. I was writing the short stories that made their way into my first book, and a lot of short stories that didn't. I am a horrifically inefficient writer, and my life was much happier once I learned that I would have to throw away half of what I wrote, whether they were short stories or novels. Once I started writing novels, I discovered something, which is that writing novels is easier than writing short stories. I think it's probably, they're easier in the way that a long marriage is easier than a series of passionate love affairs that take up the same amount of time. Novels take more resources. They can also take more punishment. A novel, a good one, is forgiving. You can misstep, digress, dither. You can take time off. Things that bother you are not a reason to break up with your novel. You think, true enough, I did not anticipate this incredibly long flashback that takes place in a terrible house in a dull town, but I've grown to love this novel. It can bore me a little bit if it wants to. As a reader, I not only forgive digressions, I love them. As a writer, I hope I'm not alone in that. So years ago, maybe 20, I decided I was done with short stories and I was going to only write novels. I had sort of had this theory that I had stretched my brain out of shape and that it was never going to shrink back to novel size. I didn't have the patience of a diorama maker, I thought. I didn't have the focus to spend time getting something so right in such a small space. It may also be that, generally speaking, I always choose the easier and more forgiving route. Or, to return to my earlier metaphor, you're less likely to get punched in the solar plexus if you're already lying in bed with a lingering illness. But here it is. It's the 21st century, and I've published another collection of short stories. And the way that this happened was I wrote 2 novels that I threw out. When I say wrote, I mean finished multiple drafts of over multiple years. When I had to give up the first, it was painful right up to the moment that I gave it up, and then it was bracing, and I felt just incredibly tough, like I had shaken off a grave injury, and I was the better for it. When I gave up the second, it was something I'm not entirely sure I'm over yet. Or, to continue my friend Bruce Albert's metaphor, over the past decade, I went through 2 terrible divorces in a row. And I found, when I had, after the second divorce, that I wasn't willing to commit to a long-term engagement. And the reason for that was I really wanted to be able to I always want to be able to jump into anything that I write with both feet, with my whole heart and my whole brain, and I didn't feel like I could do this with another novel. I was feeling extremely novel shy. But I knew that with short stories, I could, just one at a time, and then I had a book's worth. The short stories that I wrote in my late 40s are different mostly from the ones that I wrote in my early 20s, though I think if I were try to guess why, I might completely unravel my writerly brain. Speaking, as we were, of love, love is different at different times of life. Not less passionate or more impetuous, different. Life changes you. It changes you on the cellular level. You learn astonishing things. You forget astonishing things too, so completely that, looking back, it can feel like a loss of faith, and then you learn to put your faith elsewhere. Your vision changes. I always tell my students that how they think about the world is how they will write. Character, event, language, plot. Maybe as a young person, you thought that character was everything, the people you knew and loved and hated were what shaped you. Maybe, as an older person, you think that everything is down to event, the calamities and miracles of everyday life. You were right both times. I don't believe that writers simply improve as they get older, though I really hope that I have in some ways. I do believe that they change. There are things that you can write when you're 25 that you will never be able to write even 5 years later. I can't explain this, but I know that it's true. I couldn't have written my second collection 20 years ago, and I couldn't write my first one now. Obsessions persist, falling apart houses, strange exhibitions of human beings, murder, the impossibility of knowing your parents, your children, how important it is to try. I'm different, and I'm not different. I wrote a book. That's the story of any writer's life. And I'm just going to read a little bit from the first story, which, strangely, that first book that I felt tough when I walked away from, I made in, there are 3 short stories in the collection that are from that book, and to show you what a really bad novel it was, they have nothing in common. I have sometimes quizzed people to see, when I say this, they say, oh, let me guess, I want to know which stories were part of the novel. And I always say, okay, go ahead. And nobody has ever gotten it yet. That is how good a novel it was. And it was a huge pleasure to realize that I could actually do that when I was working on my first novel. Again, I'm this hugely inefficient writer. I just write pages and pages that I end up having to get rid of. And the nice thing is that I've learned that there's no shortcut to that. I'm just going to have to do it. I'm going to have to believe in the pages as I write them and say goodbye later on. But when I was working on my first novel, it was about the tallest man in the world. And my readers and editors would say, well, you know, you have to get rid of this scene, but maybe you can use it in a short story. And I would say, it's about the tallest man in the world. I don't think I can write a novel about the tallest man in the world, plus a series of essays, but because this novel was so bad, I got a few good short stories out of it, or all right short stories. I got things that looked like short stories as opposed to outtakes. And I'm going to read from the opening story, which is called Something Amazing. I should interrupt and say, this is a hard book for me to read from because there are short stories and they're all unbelievably depressing. And anytime somebody tells me that they've bought my book, I always want to say, I'm really sorry. Like maybe it should come with medication. And it's that, when I wrote them, I wasn't really planning to write a book, so I wrote a bunch of short stories. And it's that thing when you're a short story writer, when you work in any shorter form, that you think every time you write something, it's completely different from the thing that you just wrote. And then you start reading them and you realize that whatever is preoccupying you at the time is just absolutely in your story. You can never escape your subconscious. So this is the opening of Something Amazing. Just west of Boston, just north of the Turnpike, the ghost of Missy Goodby sleeps curled against the cyclone fence at the dead end of Winter Terrace, dressed in a pair of ectoplasmic dungarees. That thumping noise is Missy bopping a plastic Halloween pumpkin on one knee. That flash of light in the corner of a dark porch is the moon off the glasses she wore to correct her lazy eye. Late at night, when you walk your dog and feel suddenly cold and then unsure of yourself and then loathed by the world, that's Missy Goodby too, hissing as she had when she was alive and 6 years old. I hate you, you stink, you smell, you baby. The neighborhood kids remember Missy. She bit when she was angry and pinched no matter what. They don't feel sorry for her ghost self. They remembered the funeral they were forced to attend after she died, how her mother threw herself in the coffin wailing, how they thought she was kidding and so laughed out loud and got shushed. The way the neighborhood kids tell the story, the coffin was lowered into the ground and Missy Goodby's grieving mother leapt down and then had to be yanked from the hole like a weed. Everybody always believes the better story eventually. Really, Joyce Goodby just thumped the coffin at the graveside service, spanked it. 2 little spanks, nothing serious. She knew that pleading would never budge her daughter, not because she was dead, but because she was stubborn. All her life, the more you pleaded with Missy, the more likely she was to do something to terrify you. Joyce Goodby spanked the coffin and walked away and listened for footsteps behind her. She walked all the way home, where she took off her shoes, black pumps with worn stones of gray along the toes. Done with you, she told them. The soul is liquid and slow to evaporate. The body's a bucket and liable to slosh. Grieving, haunted, heartbroken, obsessed. Your friends will tell you to cheer up. What they really mean is dry up. But it isn't a matter of will. Only time and light will do the job. Who wants to, anyhow? Best keep in the dark and nurse the damp, cover the mirrors, keep the radio switched off, avoid the newspaper, the television, the whole outdoors, anywhere little girls congregate, though the world is manufacturing them hand over fist. Though there are now, it seems, more little girls living in the world than any other variety of human beings. Or middle-aged men whose pants don't fit, or infant boys, or young women with wide, sympathetic, fretful foreheads. Whatever you have lost, there are more of, just not yours. Sneeze, itch, gasp for breath. Seal the windows, replace the sheets, then the mattresses. Pry the mercury from your teeth. Buy appliances to scrub the air. Even then, the smell of the detergent from the sheets will fall into your nose. The chili your nice son cooks will visit you in the bedroom. The sweat from his clothes when he runs home from high school, the fog of his big yawping shoes, the awful smell of batteries loaded into a remote control car exhaust, the plastic bristles on your toothbrush, the salt air smell of baking soda once you give up toothpaste. Make your house as safe and airtight as possible. Filter the air, boil the water. The rashes stay, the wheezing gets worse. What you are allergic to can walk through walls. Again, like I'm reading that, I'm like, I should really apologize. This is really depressing. But I'd love to answer any questions because I'm much more cheery in person, generally speaking, than I am on the page. If anybody has any questions.
I'm a huge fan of yours. I have been for years. And I just wanted to ask a little bit more about your process. I know you said that you get rid of a lot of what you write. How often do you write? How much do you want to write? I mean, do you aim for twice what you would want to end up with or anything like that?
I'd like to say I had any aims at all. It's interesting because I teach writing both at the undergraduate and graduate level, and I spend a lot of time telling my students that one of the things that graduate school is for is to figure out how you write best. That the first day of my graduate school career, the director came in and said, "Real writers write every day." And I thought, well, damn. And if that's the definition of a real writer, I have never been a real writer because I don't write well when I write every day. And I do think, as I said when I was talking, I feel like the way that people write has to do with the way that they process the world, and it's very individual. And I think that's true for process as well, and what it means that a writer needs to be vigilant against laziness and figure out the time of day they work the best, and then life happens and you realize you don't always get the time of day that you work the best to write. And so my process has changed a lot. I used to be somebody who fiddled around all day and procrastinated, and then at about 8 o'clock I got nervous and began to write and would write till 2 o'clock in the morning. And now I live with other human beings who occasionally want to be fed and spoken to, and man, human beings. And some of those are my students as well, who also like to be spoken to. And I now am more likely to write 9 hours a day during breaks. And I feel like I used to romanticize what my process was for good reason, because I feel like when you get a little romantic about it, that's when you actually do it, or at least for people who don't write every day. But I think my teacher who said real writers write every day had romanticized his process. That's how he wrote best. And now I've adjusted it and trained myself to write in a different way. And part of that is because I work long hours now when I can, so I can give my full attention to my work and my full attention to the people in my life who need my full attention. I've really sort of separated it out. I do still know, I feel like I could have taken 2 lessons from learning that I have to throw out a lot of pages. One of them is to become terrified and try to lock up and write the right pages the first time, and the second is just to know that I will do it. I still, if I'm writing something that I end up having to take scenes out, I never write a scene thinking I have to take it out. And in fact, and I hate this, but if I am really enjoying writing a scene, it's a good sign that I'll probably have to take it out. That I've slipped down a strange corridor, and I'm like, I am writing, I always write to entertain myself to some extent, but I really have become my own target audience, and it's the thing. I always, for every novel I've ever written, even the ones that I threw out, I have written a scene with a house fire and a scene with a body in a house, dead body in a house. Now, there's a dead body in this house, so I think I finally don't have to do that anymore. But I think I'm probably always going to have to write the house fire scene until I actually manage to put it in something that deserves a house fire.
I'm wondering what you tell your students after they've left school and are getting feedback from you, how to find a set of people to read their writing and give them feedback, and I'm wondering what your current process is for that, since you've been writing for a long time now.
To some extent, I feel like the purpose of graduate school is to get you so that you don't need to sit in a room. It's like this invaluable process in which a bunch of people tell you what they think of your work. And I know that when I went to graduate school and I was finished with it, I thought, I'm done with that. Not everybody is, but I was done with it. And what I got out of school was a handful of people whose opinion I really trusted. And they were people who absolutely understood what I was trying to do, and some people who didn't quite understand what I was trying to do, but were so smart in ways that I wasn't, that their feedback on my work was really useful. one of the things that I've found interesting about writing for a relatively long time now is that when you're first writing and you haven't published anything, my students are amazed when I say this to them, that every writer I know wishes they could go back to the time when they were working on their first book. Because even if you're in a class where people are reading your work every week, there's this unbelievable and delightful privacy to it that a lot of people haven't read it. You aren't imagining you're abstractly hoping for a lot of people to read it, but you're not worried about it. And I now have, one of the things that's changed in my life is I used to give my work to people to read as I was writing it. One of my best friends is Ann Patchett, who, when we were working on our first books, we gave each other's books a chapter, a story at a time. And now I have been working on a novel that I have a full draft of that nobody has read, because I kind of wanted to get back in that place. And I look forward to the day that I send it to Anne, but I also know that that's the moment that my relationship with my book changes, and it's going to be great, but it's also slightly terrifying me because I'm enjoying this. To be a novelist, you have to be so filled with hubris. The idea that you're going to write hundreds of pages and people are going to be interested in it, it's ridiculous. Why would you believe that? Why would anybody believe that? And I always tell my graduate students in the first day of workshop that every writer has a mantra, and that mantra is the same for every writer, and it is, I am a genius with much to learn. And that to be a writer, you need to sort of balance the hubris and the flexibility to learn things. And I have found that not showing my work to people allows me to maintain my hubris much better for a longer period of time. And that if I think about people reading it, I'm like, oh yeah, you're right, that sentence is terrible. And at a certain point, they'll tell me the sentence is terrible and I'll take it out. But interestingly, I'm sort of learning how to extend that as opposed to shorten it. And I have readers that I trust and I wouldn't give up for the world. But I don't know why I always fall back on romance metaphors for writing, but I'm like, so right now I'm having this little, this new honeymoon relationship with this novel that I've been working on for about a year, and it's nice. I'll introduce it to my friends and family later on. They can tell me it's a bum and it'll never be good to me, and it'll be okay then. Our love will be real by then. It'll be okay. We can stay together. Oh, sorry.
That's okay. I think I've read most of your books. I have not read your current short stories. And many, many years ago, my friend gave me The Giant's House. And I loved The Giant's House.
Thanks.
And have stayed with you ever since. And I recently read Ann Patchett's book and found out that you all were close personal friends in her essays. And I thought, well, of course they are. That makes such perfect sense. So my question is, who do you like to read, and who are some of your favorite authors?
It's one of those questions that, like, writers get that question often enough. You would think that I would be able to answer it, and you ask me, and I'm like, whenever anybody asks me what books I've read, I like Lolita. It's the only book I remember ever having read.
That's fair.
You remind me, Ann Patchett's books, they're awesome. I'm trying to think of the books that I have read recently, and part of this is, again, I have a 5- and 7-year-old, so I read, but I often forget what I read right afterwards. And weirdly, the books that have really been staying with me lately is I've been rereading Peter Pan to them, which is the most phenomenal book. And I also, the two books I read this summer that I have particularly loved are Roxane Gay's Bad Feminist, which everybody is reading and really loving, and Christina Henriquez's book of Unknown Americans, which is a book that I think is just extraordinary. I like Rose Tremaine, who's an English writer, who's got a collection of stories coming out in the fall, who wrote Sacred Country, which is one of my favorite books in the entire world. I love Edward P. Jones, who I think is the greatest living American short story writer, also a wonderful novelist, but his short stories particularly mean something to me. Lolita. Did I mention Lolita? I really like Lolita. I like Dickens.
As I was listening to you read, I was asking myself, is this prose poetry? I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that particular label and what it might mean to you.
I used to write poetry. When I was in college, I had the amazing chance to take George Starbuck's graduate poetry writing class at Boston University. And I wrote it seriously, but not well. And I feel like, and I read a lot of poetry, that part of it is that stretching the brain, that the poetry that I love is so mysteriously elliptical, that poetry that really means something to me has left stuff out, and I am really bad at leaving stuff out. But I'm still very taken with, every now and then you meet a writer who says, I don't really care about language, and I always think, you are in the wrong line of work. And I like a lot of very spare language. It's not that I think that all language must be, must strive to be doing acrobatics. I obsess over my sentences, and I know that there are some people who say that language that calls attention to itself isn't doing its job, but as a reader, it's my weak spot, and as a writer, too. I'm relatively neurotic about my work. I exist in various levels of self-loathing and self-aggrandizement, but the place that I never sort of think of a book or a short story, wow, I really nailed it. But I do write sentences, and I'm like, that is all right, that sentence. I will put up that sentence against a lot of people's sentences. So, yeah, that's.
Hi, I was wondering if you had any advice for young writers.
There's always that moment I'm like, I'm going to make a smart remark. That's wrong. Don't make a smart remark. My advice for young writers is two things. One of which is the old standby that the most important thing to do is read, and it's because writing is a muscular process, and you need the exercise of having read really sentences that mean a lot to you and characters that mean a lot to you. It is impossible to perform the muscular acts you have to do unless you have exercised your brain in that particular way. It's not that you look to those writers as models, although you will automatically do that. It's that otherwise you're using underdeveloped parts of your brain to try to do something. And the other one is something that I touched on when I was talking, which is I really feel firmly that there are things you can only write when you're young, and that you change as you get older, and there are things that you think, I can't remember that anymore, or I don't feel this way anymore, and it's not an improvement. I mean, I do think there are some ways in which you improve, but there are a lot of ways you're just further away from that, and that it's really important to hold on to that material and write about it when you can. I work with people who are 18, 19 to about 25, some older students, and many of them have this sense where they think, well, I'm writing this now, but I feel like I need to get a little older to really write stuff. And I would say that's just not true. I mean, besides the long list of great literature that's been created by people in their teens and their 20s, you're not losing time, but you are losing parts of yourself that will change. Even if you are older and you don't realize they've changed, you have access to things. Anything else? Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.